Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. I'm just waiting for our clicks to kind of level off. I think we're leveling off here. Okay. My name is Emily McCobb from Tufts University. I am just here making sure the webinar works okay. I'm going to introduce Julia in a minute, and she's going to introduce our speaker and kick things off. I just want to go over the logistics for the webinar. So you guys are all muted automatically, and we can't see you, so feel free to eat dinner or whatever it is that you're doing. If you have a question for Anne, please go ahead and put it in the Q&A, and Anne will answer all the questions at the end of the talk. And so we'll have a record of them, and we'll get your questions answered as best we can. If you have an issue with the technology or a problem that me or Alana need to troubleshoot, please put that in the chat. And for sure, feel free to use the chat to say hey and whatnot, but put the questions for the speaker in the Q&A. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julia, who will welcome you from MAC and introduce our speaker. Oops.
There we go. Thanks, Emily. Hi, everybody. My name is Julia Peshek. I'm the president of the Massachusetts Animal Coalition, and we are very excited to have you all here with us tonight. For those of you that aren't familiar with the Massachusetts Animal Coalition, we call ourselves MAC, that's our acronym. We're a statewide coalition that was formed in 2000 in Massachusetts, and essentially the mission of MAC is to maintain a leadership role within the state of Massachusetts and foster collaboration with animal welfare professionals in Massachusetts and beyond, really. And so we have typically had a series of workshops that we do, educational workshops that we do throughout the year, every year, and in person. And we've been doing that way for many, many years, but obviously everything has shifted in the last 11 months. And so we are bringing you guys all our workshops in a different format through Zoom, and which is great because we get to see people from all over the place. And hopefully it makes it a little bit more convenient for everybody to get together and join in on this. So we're really excited. This is our second one that we're offering. We'll be doing a series of these throughout the year. And tonight's topic is on compassion fatigue, which is probably a very timely thing. It's an important topic in any time in animal welfare, but especially now, this is a difficult time. So we're really excited that Ann Lindsay agreed to present on this for us. Ann is also a part of MAC. She's actually the founder of MAC, and she's on our board. She also has a master's in counseling psychology and has done a lot of research and work on the topic of compassion fatigue. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Ann. And actually, before I do that, one thing that I keep forgetting to do, I wanted to thank Emily and Ginny from Tufts for their help in putting this together and for sponsoring this workshop. And then also to the MAC board for helping pull all this together. And obviously to Ann for presenting on this. So with that, I will turn this over to Ann, who can introduce herself a little bit further and then get started.
Can everybody hear me? Yes? Okay. I was also going to thank Tufts, but now that Julia has done so, I will just sort of piggyback off that and thank both Ginny Shagru, who's the coordinator of the Center for Animals and Public Policy, and Emily McCobb, who we just talked to, and she's the assistant director there. And I just wanted to give them a plug, which is that they have an amazing repository of research, and they also offer a 12 to 16 month master's program focusing on the human animal bond and public policy issues. So I just think it would be interesting for some of you maybe to take a look at it. So I'm gonna take myself off of video, and I'm gonna start this, okay? So going off of video, and I'll come back on for Q&A, but for now, I'm just gonna do it like that. So, I would like to start with saying, first of all, that I will probably say we a lot throughout this. And the reason I will be saying we is because I am one of you. I am somebody who has had a lot of experience, a lot of the experiences that you have all had. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself first, okay? So here I am, and I've always, as an adult, had not just one dog, but a bunch of dogs, okay? And then I started working in shelter and rescue work, and I've done that off and on for years. And then I got involved by being on the founding board of MAC, Massachusetts Animal Coalition, which, by the way, turned 21 years old and is now legal to drink on February 12th. So many years we've been in existence. And then I'm also on the board of SMART, the state of Massachusetts Animal Response Team. And then I happened to marry a veterinarian, which I would highly recommend for anyone who is in this field, because it really helps to have somebody that you can bug for answering questions and stuff. So that's a plug. And then I became a cat person because my husband brought cats into my life. And so now we have dogs and cats. And then I decided to go get my master's in counseling psychology at Lesley University. And I studied trauma in this master's program. And I also happened to get a certificate in animal care and compassion fatigue through HSUS. So just FYI, I did that. And now we have chickens. They're my chickens. And I adopted them from the Animal Rescue League and MSPCA. So that's just a little bit about me. Okay. One of the things that I will say is that I studied in this part of the field because sometimes compassion fatigue consultants or therapists are very well-meaning counselors, but if they haven't lived this, they may miss the subtle stuff of our crazy animal world. So there's a lot to educate a therapist or a counselor about. And I have personally suffered from compassion fatigue, so I know what I'm talking about. I also wanted to mention that I will probably repeat some points throughout for the purpose of making sure that it gets stated enough so that people hear it. Okay, so I know I'm repeating. I think I would like to start by saying that we all start out in this field with hope. We're happy, we're excited that we found our calling. We love animals. We see ourselves stepping in and helping, and we feel fulfilled, and we feel happy and satisfied. And then there's this day that things change. For those of you who are new, you don't maybe know that yet. For those of you who have been around the block for a while, you definitely know. And this tonight is about that change. What is it? Is it a full-blown compassion fatigue, or is it burnout, or is it both? So the goals for today are to learn about compassion fatigue and burnout and compassion satisfaction, and to talk about the risks that this field brings and what effects it has on you and others. What is your role at work? How do you collaborate to ease this burden that it is a burden? What are the strategies for healing your organization? And then at the very end, we'll talk about resources and how to ask for help, okay? So who is this for? This is for everybody. And I talk about all these various people. Some of them are very obvious, but then I get to the bosses of the animal control officers, because those bosses may be at the Board of Health, they may be the Board of Selectmen, they may be the police chief. And we can't possibly expect an animal control officer's boss to necessarily understand what the animal control officer's life world is like. So hopefully there's a way for this to get to your bosses, those of you who are animal control officers. I also put animal disaster responders, and then there are more, but this is, primarily for people who help animals. Okay. The other thing I will say is that COVID has presented new challenges in the way shelters and vet hospitals and clinics are operated. And so that has resulted in a great deal of stress, and that translates into even heavier emotional loads for people. So this topic is clearly timely, and hopefully the information will provide some food for thought for everyone. So what we will cover, this is just an outline of what we're going to cover. So we're going to do introduction, definition, symptoms, we're going to do the little discussion and perspective. And then there are 5 steps toward healing that we'll walk through. And then finally, we'll talk about organizational health. And then actually at the end, I will just talk about resources. And you should have received those documents, the resources document and the suggestions for how to find a therapist document already. Okay. So let's set this table. Who are we as animal people? We have various experiences, educations. We're different. We're just all so different from one another. And there's some of us who are brand new, and there's some of us who have been at it for years and years and years. We weren't trained in customer service. And I think anybody who works at the front desk is aware of that fact. Some of us don't eat meat or wear leather. Some of us do. And then our beliefs. I made a big list. Outdoor cats, how dogs should be housed or trained, about pinch collars, choke chains, harnesses, who is and isn't worthy of adopting an animal. And I could go on and on. But we all have many, many beliefs about things that honestly, it's never ending. We aren't always considered normal, and I say that with affection because a lot of us aren't. And we got into this because we love animals. We also, as a result of all of this craziness, we end up having to deal with people, personalities, politics, perspectives, and pathologies. And it's enough sometimes to drive you crazy. So, how are you doing now? This is the ProQual test, and I had that sent out. Alana sent that out with the registration, I believe, so that some of you, if you wanted to, you could go ahead and take the test in advance. This is a test, a tool for screening. It's not a test, actually. It's not a pass-fail. It's a way of establishing where you are on the compassion fatigue scale and the compassion satisfaction scale. And my suggestion is that if you haven't taken it, take it. And it automatically tallies for you, so you don't have to do that part. But it gives you a baseline, and then you can take it from there, and you can test yourself, maybe 6 months from now, a year from now, 5 years from now. Save your results and see where you are. Are you getting better? Are you getting worse? And it's just a way of helping you. So the question is, how did you do if you did take the test, and what might have bubbled up for you after finding out where you are on things? So please use it as a tool. Okay. So when I do these compassion fatigue workshops, I go around the room and I say to people beforehand, so how are you feeling? How do you like your work? Blah, blah, blah. And this is the kind of information I get, just popcorn kind of people popping up and saying what they're feeling. And as you can see, that if the 2 first columns are just really sad, and they're absolutely beyond overwhelmed. They're angry, they're numb, they're bitter, they have so many things going on. And then there were a few, not many, who said rewarded, hopeful, satisfied, and fulfilled. And that is sad, but I will tell you that after a workshop, I will say, how do you feel now? And this is what people say. I don't feel so alone. There's a name for what I feel. I have a lack of balance in my work and my personal life. I need to know my limits and how to say no. I need to focus on being resilient, figure out how to leave work at work, and I need a community that I can count on. Those are the things that they learned from being in a workshop. Now, in the past, I've been in-person workshops and presentations. So that's from, sitting with a group of people and kind of forcing them to come up with something. But so that gives hopefully some of you some hope. So let's ask ourselves, is the work you're doing or the life you're living taking a toll on you? Do you feel fatigue, hopelessness, helplessness? How about your coworkers and your volunteers that you work with? Do you feel like you can't do enough? Cynical? Can you change the source of the stress? Do you know how? What's the emotional toll that comes from not managing your stress at work? And if you're new to the job, how can you protect yourself? These are all questions to ask yourselves privately. And then I'm going to give you some perspective. So for those of you who are new to this field, this won't maybe mean as much as it will to those who have been at this for a long time. But I'm going to give you some MSPCA stats, Massachusetts SPCA, for those of you who aren't in Massachusetts, okay? In the 1970s, MSPCA admitted over 25,000 kittens per year, 2,000 plus kittens per month in the summer. Wrap your brain around that for a minute, okay? 25,000 kittens per year. In 2016, 1,002 kittens were admitted, 799 in 2019, and 606 in 2020. So that gives you some sense of how things have improved in Massachusetts and also in New England. If you're from another state, if you're in the South or in the other parts of the country, you may not have these successes, but this is possible. And so my reason for putting this up is because it's to give you hope and to help you recognize that all the hard work that people have done over the years, that it's really paid off over the years. And there is clearly a big difference between the 1970s and today. Okay. So the results of that, today we are dealing with the individual animal rather than the numbers. I wanted to be sure to say that, and I forgot. In New England, we're able to do that. So there isn't this wholesale, euthanasia decision that has to be made. And so these animals are getting a lot more than they ever could have gotten in the 1970s. Okay. The results of that are that we have much more collaboration for animals. We have a lot of animals coming from out of state, and we're also moving animals around within our state. Our advocates are more informed as a result because of more education and training opportunities. And the number of euthanasias is much less. And as I said, you can treat the individual animal, so you can work on these behavioral and medical issues and challenges. And there are many active spay-neuter clinics, which makes a difference, but only in parts of Massachusetts. And we're learning that in the process of our research. And happily, ACOs are being seen as professionals, more so than they ever have been before. So there has been a lot that's come out of this that has really, it can give people hope. And so I'm going to give you some definitions, okay? The first one is burnout. And I'm going to show you what burnout is, and then I'm going to compare it to what compassion fatigue is so that you can understand the difference, okay? So burnout is work related, okay? It's exhaustion from dissatisfaction with your work. So burnout has to do with work, and you feel powerless, ineffective, etc. And you can change your job and you can heal from burnout. And it does not relate to trauma. So remember that it's work related and it does not relate to trauma. Okay. And the symptoms of burnout are in this little square: exhaustion, hardened, numb, anxiety and depression, and then less investment in accomplishing work goals. And so you may be saying to yourself right now, oh, maybe I have burnout. And maybe you do. Maybe you have both. Or maybe when you see what compassion fatigue is, you'll change your mind. So, compassion fatigue. Now, this is important. This is about what is happening to others. And by that, I mean that you are listening to other people's stories. You have emotional exhaustion because you've had repeated exposure to traumatic situations or stories. Now, what that means for us in this field is that we're dealing with animals. And so they don't talk. So they're not telling you their stories, but we're supposing their stories, or we know their stories because someone has, the surrenderer has given a full story, or we know. And sometimes we make it up, and I will say that we make it up because we need to have some explanation for what happened to this animal. But so compassion fatigue has to do with what's happening to others. It's not any experience that you necessarily have had directly on your own, okay? And naturally empathic people are at higher risk. They are more deeply feeling, and it affects them. And they have and they can end up having a difficulty with feeling empathy for others. In particular, maybe the person who surrenders their animal, maybe a coworker who just sort of rubs them the wrong way, maybe their loved ones. And it's often called the cost of caring. And you're unable to refuel and regenerate, and you have nothing left to give. So it's the negative aspects of helping. And if I back up, I'm going to back up to, whoops, I'm not backing up. I'm going to back up and I'm going to show you burnout. So burnout is work related and not trauma related. Okay. Compassion fatigue is more trauma related, and it's about what's happening to others. Okay. And we will discuss those symptoms further in a little while. Other names that people use for compassion fatigue: vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which is really, I think, more for those who've experienced trauma directly, and empathic distress. These are all meaning that you're feeling pretty overwhelmed. So trauma is happening to you. Okay, this is the difference. All traumatized people have lost something. Usually the thing they have lost is the safe, predictable world that they knew, and it can touch someone at the deepest existential level. All right, so trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, etc. Immediately after the event, shock and denial are typical. Longer-term reactions include unpredictable emotions, flashbacks, strained relationships, and physical symptoms like headaches or nausea. This is the APA definition. And how you process trauma depends on your history. So did you have some previous trauma? That's going to definitely have some bearing on how you're processing other trauma, what kind of social or family support you've had, and how you interpret the experience, what your perception is, and much more. But um, one of the most important things we can do if we have any kind of trauma history is try to operate from a position of not being a victim. That's very important, because otherwise you just get completely sucked into the drama of it. So now I'm going to talk about Charles Figley. Now, he was a pioneer researcher in burnout and in the helping fields, and he was in Vietnam. And when he came back in the late 60s, he was looking at combat related stress reactions. Okay, so he's got a couple quotes that I think are great. We've not been directly exposed to the trauma scene, but we hear the story told with such intensity. So there's that not directly exposed factor. Or we hear similar stories so often, or we have the gift and curse of extreme empathy and we suffer. We feel the feelings of our clients, in this case, the animals, perhaps the owners of the animals. We experience their fears, we dream their dreams, and eventually we lose a certain spark of optimism, humor, and hope. We tire. We aren't sick, but we aren't ourselves. And I think that says so much. A few more thoughts. Let's see. So this is another quote from him. And compassion fatigue is the natural consequence of stress resulting from caring and helping traumatized or suffering people or animals. Again, it's from helping others. It's from their stories affecting you. These outward signs are displays of stress resulting from giving care to others. Compassion fatigue is a secondary traumatic stress disorder, and it is a set of symptoms and not a disease. Okay. So a few more thoughts about compassion fatigue. It's the emotional residue or strain of being exposed to those who have suffered from traumatic events, and it comes from absorbing the suffering of your clients. So I'm sort of saying the same thing many ways. It's to help you all understand that compassion fatigue comes from what you are witnessing, and you can develop it by helping one animal, or you can have it happen to you over many years. It just depends on who you are. And it differs from burnout, but it can coexist. So the question that you might all want to ask yourselves is, am I suffering from burnout? Am I suffering from compassion fatigue? Or am I suffering from both? And if you're suffering from both and you quit your job because you have burnout and you find another job that makes you happier, then you don't have the burnout going on anymore. So it's a funny dance that you need to do. So, and then compassion satisfaction is obviously the opposite, the positive aspects of helping and the satisfaction you get from helping others, and you're feeling effective and accomplished. Okay. So the symptoms of compassion fatigue. Are you ready? Fatigue, everything is a chore. I love that picture. Persistent physical ailments. You're prone to accidents. You have insomnia and you're oversleeping, or you're oversleeping. So those are the physical. I'm going back so everybody can look at those. Those are the physical aspects. All right. So what are the psychological signs? So that pure emotional exhaustion, and remember, you're looking at this compassion fatigue, not burnout. Depression, sadness, apathy. You just don't feel empathic or sympathetic toward others. You have a hard time with that whole personal, professional thing. And you're cynical, and you think you're not making a difference, and you're having a hard time focusing. And then you have problems with intimacy, and that doesn't necessarily mean just sex. It means intimacy as in being close to people, friends, coworkers. Again, I'm going back. I'm going to let you look at that for a minute. And then we've got the the behavioral signs, okay? an increase in use of alcohol and drugs, risky behavior. And you have a trigger temper, bottled up emotions, you're irritable. That's a Boston driver, I would say. Isolation from others, a lack of interest in self-care practices. And I put that in there to be funny, but actually I know, and I think we all know people where we've seen that, and you can see some of this. I mean, I'm not asking you to look at other people during this. I'm actually asking you to look at yourself. It's hard not to say though sometimes, oh, that's so and so. So one Charles Figley quote that I think is really worth throwing in here too is, it isn't just one trauma story, but an accumulation of hundreds of stories, a cumulative level of trauma that affects the people who listen. So most symptoms of PTSD are the same for everyone. And this can be the same. You can assume that this is similar to compassion fatigue. Isolation, nightmares, flashbacks, irritability, flash anger, self-contempt. Like primary PTSD, compassion fatigue takes time to manifest, though it can seem to have arrived overnight. This is what he's saying. It is an accumulation of others' experiences that leaves one blunted, numb, and worn out. It is not burnout, which is apathy, stagnation, and frustration concerning work. And compassion fatigue can affect every part of life. So let's discuss this and provide some perspective. So if there's any message I want it to be that you take away, I want it to be that it's about your role and how you contribute and or detract from the mission of your work. So let's take a look at animal work. We all know it's high stress and the system is clearly not healthy. There are some great organizations that are very well run, but there are also a lot of organizations that aren't, and it's because they're animal people and they're not necessarily management consultant types. So there are three places where a role is played. Society plays a role, and that's the, I don't want my animal anymore, or they maybe do want to adopt, but you don't have the right animal for them or whatever. But that is one part of this. Another part is the organizations and the city and town governments and the rescue community. And all of those play a role. And depending upon how each of those entities behave, that can contribute to your trauma response. So if you have a very dysfunctional boss or a dysfunctional board, or, I could go on and on, it's going to contribute to your trauma response level and your compassion fatigue. And then the other part of this is that you play a role, and that includes the history, the baggage that you bring into the workplace. And that's the part I hope you will pay attention to. You can't do much about the first two, but you can certainly focus on your own role. So what do you bring to this work? What's your baggage? So you bring your educational background, which could be anything. You could be a PhD, you could be a college graduate, you could be a high school graduate, you might not have graduated from high school, any kind of level of education. Everybody is involved in this. You bring learning styles that might present some issues. You might be an external processor versus an internal processor. And if you're an external processor like I am, meaning I have to think everything out aloud, an internal processor who needs to sit quietly and figure things out on their own might be driven absolutely crazy by somebody like me. So whatever your learning style is and your style of functioning can have a lot to do with what you bring into this work. Financial issues, just basically your life experiences and your overall beliefs about things, and whether you have positive or negative social support systems. And do you have a history of trauma, illness, dysfunction, and generational issues? And I put issues in quotes because there are a lot of issues out there. as we well know. And then possibly you have complicated relationships with families and others. So these are the kinds of things that we're bringing into this work, which is already messed up anyway and not very functional. And then we're bringing our stuff in and adding to it. So let's talk about the possibilities for why we might get compassion fatigue. How we are built and just that we're human. We might be wounded healers and have unhealthy behavior patterns. And here I go kind of repeating myself. I'm talking about our history, our family history, our baggage, lack of good personal boundaries and self-awareness. If we don't know how to tell somebody to back off, or if we don't even know that somebody should back off, if we don't even get that they have stepped over a line that they shouldn't have stepped over, that sort of stuff can lend to all sorts of stress ultimately, and issues with people. Another possibility, unresolved past trauma. So the exposure to trauma at your workplace can trigger experiences that you've had in the past that are your personal traumas. And it's hard to leave your personal life at the door. And I will tell you that trauma I call trauma life's indignities. And it can range from intense bullying in school to a catastrophic event like a fire or physical or sexual abuse. But trauma shapes our lives, and we're bringing our trauma history to work in an animal protection job, and that can be very triggering. And again, potential growth rather than seeing yourself as a victim, that's the thing that you want to try to focus on. How do you grow from it rather than shriveling from it? Another possibility is that you're just absolutely wiped out. And then there's this moral conflict, and we'll talk about this more, but moral conflict, asked to do things that are contrary to what you think is right. And that includes euthanasia. That includes maybe adopting an animal to someone that you don't feel comfortable adopting the animal to. There are all sorts of moral conflicts in this field. So that's another possibility why you might get compassion fatigue. And then we get no emotional preparation for this work, none. And the system, again, is unhealthy. There I go repeating myself. But I think it's important to keep saying these things because these are the things that we need to grapple with as individuals, as organizations, and as an industry. So let's talk a little bit about chronic stress, just so that you understand there is a mind-body connection. And what it means is that if you've constantly got stress going on and you're in your head and it's just, rattling around in your head and you can't remove it, and you're not expelling the energy by going and doing something else or going out for a walk or going to the gym or whatever, then you're leaving your nervous system in suspension, and that's what humans can do to themselves. Whereas animals, look at that dog shaking it off. They shake it off, and they're able to any animal is able to have the predator chasing them, and then the predator doesn't catch them, and the animal is able to shake it off because they have to go back to surviving and finding food, etc. Humans are not good at that. We don't turn it off. So that chronic stress is affecting us. All right. How have you been affected by this work? I love this picture. And I feel like that sometimes, for sure. And I'm sure many of you do. How have you been affected? And so this is the whole issue of cumulative stress and the things that it can do to your body. And look at all these parts, all these systems in your body that can be affected. So if you have stomach issues, or if your thyroid is out of whack, I mean, there are all sorts of things that can be a result of the fact that you're just constantly in stress mode and your cortisol is through the roof. So, and then there's that overall wear and tear in your body, and we do age prematurely. I really feel that. So those are things to consider. And then here's a question. Since you started in this field, how have you changed? Who did you used to be? And who are you now? I think that's a really big, important question to take on board and to really grapple with, because if you're so different from the way you were before, that says so much, because there's a cost. Okay, now I'm going to do a quote. I can't find who did this quote, and I did a Google search and I just can't find, so I can't credit this person, but it's great. It's too good to not include, so I'm including it if I can get. There we go. Oh, maybe I missed it. Well, anyway, we'll see. Oh, yeah, this is the one. I think this is the one. Yes. The compassion fatigue survey administered to animal care workers found that despite great suffering, personal pain, and witnessing animal suffering, they continue in the profession because of their passion for it. This mindset develops into a form of emotional self-injury. Does that sound familiar? And then it's not the load that breaks us down, it's the way we carry it. And that's very true. And it's, taking that all on board is a lot, but if you can walk away from this knowing that how you carry this stuff around has everything to do with how you're doing or not doing. And I just love this. I didn't have surgery, I just don't feel like socializing. And I think that says how many of us feel at various times during this career that we're all in. So let's talk about steps toward healing. So we're going to talk about the 5 bullets you see here: self-care, support, work satisfaction, resiliency, and organizational health. So we're going to start with self-care. First of all, self-care involves feeding your brain, and that means you shouldn't be isolating yourself, and you should pursue getting some professional development. That helps you feel like you're a part of things, but it also feeds your brain. And that involves conferences, meetings, the greater mission. And I had the resources list that I sent out has lots of stuff for you. And then the next thing is replenish yourself. I love this picture. This is like one of my most favorite pictures. I counted and I think there are 8 dogs on that bed. Replenish. Just like we need food and water for our bodies, we need to feed our souls as well. So these dogs are relaxed and breathing deeply, and I think that's kind of cool. That's what we should all do. And that means maybe meditating, maybe just going quiet for a while, finding spirituality, religion, nature, solitude, quiet. And you notice I have quiet, 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 and I put it there because there's noise in our brains and we don't know how to access that quiet. And that quiet is what gives us the opportunity to get healthy. And then getting healthy, get moving, get outside and breathe. And exercise, as we all know, is a great way to manage stress. And then create, get outside of yourself, challenge yourself to do something different. Find hobbies and interests that are not part of your animal work. I happen to watercolor. And when I watercolor, I completely disappear. It's like time stands still. Same thing, I garden. Find something that doesn't involve animal work and it will give you a break. And then cultivate a support system. And that involves finding your tribe. And that means talking to people who get it. And then you need to maintain those connections. You need to have your soul fed by the right kinds of people. And you need to laugh until it hurts. You need to have that outlet. And unfortunately, a lot of us think our tribe should be all animal welfare people. And, I don't know if it's possible to have non-animal shelter people to be friends with, but it would be helpful. It might not be possible, but it would be helpful if you could try, because it takes you away from that world for a while. Identifying with others and confiding in them is part of recovering from trauma. And then as far as work people are concerned, create a coalition of other animal people, even if it means meeting for coffee once a month at the Dunkin' Donuts after the COVID pandemic, of course. But I say this to animal control officers when I present at ACOM, Animal Control Officers Association of Massachusetts, at their training. I talk to them about, find other animal control officers who are near you so you can compare notes and help each other. Share ideas, collaborate, and debrief appropriately, which I'll talk about in a second. And recognizing that saving animals has got to be a team effort. And when I say debrief appropriately, I mean, we tend to tell our friends, whether it's work people or family, maybe some pretty horrible stuff that we've experienced in our job. And you just can't do that to other people without them being prepared and without them having the right tools to deal with it. So the best thing you can do is say, I need to vent, or I need to tell you what happened today. Are you able to take it on? And then you have to hear the person. If they say you get 5 minutes, that means 5 minutes. So it's a little piece of information that I've learned over the years. I used to have a boyfriend years ago, and I'd tell him stuff, and finally he just screamed at me and he said, I can't take it anymore. You need to stop telling me. And I had no idea. So, and then get help. Counselor, pastor, rabbi, imam, guru, etc., support group. And then all of the Al-Anons and so AA is Alcoholics Anonymous for people who have drinking issues. Al-Anon is for the families of the people who have drinking issues. Narcotics Anonymous is obviously for those who have narcotics issues. And then big organizations have employee assistance plans. I know that Animal Rescue League of Boston, for example, has an EAP, and that's a place where you can go to get some counseling, to get some direction. And I also put in this little rectangle down here, see suggestions for how to find a therapist document, which is something that came to you already. Read through that, and you'll see at the end, I say, if you can't figure it out, let me know and I'll help you figure it out. Okay. And then another thing, develop satisfaction with your work. Another way to heal is to find satisfaction. So make meaning in your work. And if you can't read this, it says, really, I'm fine. It was just a fleeting sense of purpose. I'm sure it will pass. And so the real message here is to connect work to service. So remind yourself of who you serve. Who do you serve? I would say that we serve animals. We serve the community. We serve maybe our board. Who do you serve? And it's a way to make yourself remember that you've got a greater mission. Make your work a craft. What does that mean? It means to pursue being excellent in service of others. So you might be somebody who works at an animal shelter, and maybe, I don't know, maybe you could do something like be an expert at cleaning protocols. That is very important. And being that go-to person. Or maybe you specialize in dog and cat behavior, or maybe you're an excellent customer service rep. Find what you're good at and try to make your work a craft, and it gives you meaning. And then invest in healthy work relationships. That might mean if you're a senior person, maybe you mentor someone, or maybe you decide to take the lead on planning an event. And instead of just having your clique that you hang with, which is not very healthy, include people who aren't in your clique. That's how you invest in healthy work relationships. And then remember why you work. Are you really going to work just to pay the bills? If you're in animal work, maybe not. There's more going on than just making a paycheck. So remember why you work. And you don't find meaning, you have to build it. So it's a project, and it's a tough project, but it's a worthy project, making meaning. And then there's finding purpose. And this is a quote from this Australian organizational consultant, Peter Drucker. The number of people who are really motivated by money is very small. Most people need to feel that they are here for a purpose. And unless an organization can connect to this need to leave something behind that makes this a better world, it won't be successful over time. That's interesting. And then finding balance. And we're talking about, is your life all work? Do you live and breathe animals and animal people? We discussed this earlier. So it's about exercise and learning and growing and connecting. And that kind of self-care is imperative in order to move forward. And then take personal responsibility. I think this is a riot. It was the dog. Take personal responsibility. And I say that, and I know it's easier said than done, but taking personal responsibility has everything to do with your relationships with people and your relationships with the work you do. So by taking personal responsibility, it's going to require you to develop better self-awareness. And that involves learning to create a filter. Trauma, drama, no drama. And so that's where you say, I can't hear any more stories, or I'm not going to watch the news anymore. I can't take it, or whatever. So getting better self-awareness and recognizing what your limits are and creating those boundaries. And I'm saying, can you say no? And I mean it, because there are a lot of people who can't. And so ask yourself, are you aware of how you affect others? Do you take on too much? Do you think you're the only one who can do things correctly? Those are all really interesting questions to ask yourself about who you are and how you function in the world and in your workplace. Look inward. What does your family say about you? How is it to be your spouse, your significant other, your kid, your parent, or your pet? Is your pet waiting for you by the window all the time because you're never around? Does your family say they worry about you? Are you present when you are with them? And do you misbehave at home? And are you the same person you were before you started this job? Again, it's the same question asked in a different way. Are you the same person when you think back to when you started this job? Ask yourself, are you comfortable with your role in your family? These are tough questions. What about your friendships? Do you know if your friends think they can count on you? And do you make choices that are really bad? Do you have friendships that are toxic, negative, dysfunctional, drama and conflict? Are you hard to be around? So ask yourself, are you a good friend? And then what about at work? What keeps you going to work each day? I presume it's the animals, but is there anything else? What's the culture at work? And then what are your defenses? There's negative, dark humor, there's sarcasm, there's passive aggression, there's blaming and denying. And what that means is not taking responsibility. And we just talked about taking responsibility. Ask yourself, what role do you play at the shelter or rescue? So is the shelter or rescue a healthy place to work? Is there a structure and a clear set of boundaries and expectations that you can work under? Do you know what you're supposed to be doing? Do you know what you're not supposed to be doing? Are you part of the conflict? And are you one of those people who fans the flames? And do you pass judgment without knowing the entire story? And here's one. Can you be counted to stay in your lane? In other words, are you doing other people's jobs because you can do it best? And do you carry your share of the load? These are all questions that, we can all relate to at some level. And then I included two group dynamics links in the resources document that refers to all of this discussion. So there are common interpersonal issues that go on at work. One is competition, another is judgment and gossip, and then that whole blaming or sabotaging of others. And then there is triangulation. Triangulation, I call it scratching an itch, but it's actually a manipulation tactic. And it's where one person won't communicate directly with another person and uses the third person, a third person, to relay communication to the second, forming a triangle. And it's a way of controlling a relationship between two people or parties by controlling the communication between them. So an example would be, you're mad at Susie, and so you tell Sharon everything about Susie, and then so that Sharon will then tell Susie rather than directly going to Susie. And these are called immature defenses, and they're very toxic. And there are a whole bunch of immature defenses: acting out, passive aggression, projection, denial. There are a whole bunch of them. And if anybody's interested, I can give you more information on that. Do you have many ex-friends? See, here are a few more questions. Are you the common denominator in the drama? Are you, and most of you are females on this, I imagine, and I apologize to any men who are on this, but are you a mean girl or are you a mean boy? And are you often in the middle of stuff? And I will tell you that I often say that if someone is acting poorly, that it is likely not the first time they're doing this, and it just may be the first time I'm seeing it. But if somebody acts like a real jerk, I try to tell myself, wait a minute, that's not the first time that person's done this behavior. I just happen to be the one that's seeing it now. So kind of bear that one in mind. Do you have there are problems with communication at work? And I mentioned immature defenses. So here's the question. Do any of these behaviors sound familiar? So you can't change the nature of the work we're doing necessarily and the level of our exposure to trauma and dysfunction. However, you can change your behavior and how you react to it. And you can also look at your perception of what is happening. So this is the whole thing about perception versus reality. If you're assuming something and you don't really have the facts, then you're creating a narrative, which is a perception, and it's very damaging. So I studied with two people, Eric Gentry and Tracy Zaparanik, when I participated in their animal care compassion fatigue specialist training, and they talked a lot about perception. And so this was all about how you see things and how you process things based on what you believe. And if you're believing something that isn't true or is distorted, you're screwing up the system. So my little suggestion would be that you really get the facts. Few things to think about. So clarify your goals and objectives. What would you want people to say about you in your obituary? I know that's morbid, but think about it. And actually, I've done some compassion fatigue workshops where I've asked people to write their obituary. And I mean, it gets you thinking about, well, who am I and how do I really want to be remembered? The old cliche that you can't save the entire world. And being good at your job should also include healthy pursuits, as we've talked about: personal growth, emotional strength, a belief in the value of self-care. And you need to work on being the best you can be as an individual and a professional. something else to think about. Every time there's a skirmish in your organization, it affects others. So by taking personal responsibility for your own behavior, it means you're able to control your reactions and not negatively affect others. And for me, it always comes down to the animals. And so if you're upset and acting out and not the best that you can be, the animals feel the stress, and it's the people who ruin it for the animals. I say that a lot. And we have a moral obligation to be mature and professional. And I know it's easier said than done, but the animals are the ones who lose out when we misbehave. So I know I sound preachy, but I've been watching this for years and I've misbehaved, and I fully admit it. And I've learned a lot from doing that, from misbehaving and the fallout. Oh, we are all the animals have, and it's true. And then let's talk about moral stress, also called moral conflict, moral injury. There's a lot of research that's being done on that, on it because of post-war things. What if people during wars had to do that they weren't comfortable doing? And it's when policies conflict with your morals and your ethics, and it's a significant contributor to what we're talking about. And it causes clashes among everybody, moral stress, and it erodes relationships. And the euthanasia decisions in shelters and rescues often devolve into an us versus them scenario. And I will just say, I'm going to go back for a second. I just want to talk about euthanasia for 1 second. And I want to say that no one likes making the decision. And so I have been in on many years of volunteers being angry with managers, managers being mad at board members or whatever. And when a euthanasia decision is made, I would like to hope that it's not made lightly, that it is something. I know when I've had to make decisions, I have tossed and turned and I've tried to pull rabbits out of hats. And I honestly, you just get to the point where there's just nothing left for a particular animal that you can think of or that you have the resources for. And it's a brutal decision. And so the moral stress that goes with that is very hard. And then having people question you, it really hurts, and it really creates factions. So I would just ask everybody to consider that. So resilience is about reframing. It's a way of shifting the focus, okay, and making the cup half empty, that's half empty, into the half full cup. So here's a couple definitions of resilience. Tending to recover from or adjust easily to misfortune or change. The process of self-righting or growth. The capacity to bounce back, withstand hardship, and to repair yourself. And so there's a lot of research on resilience. We're not born that way. We learn how to be resilient. We develop that ability. And each person has the capacity for self-righting. And the 4 components are connection, wellness, healthy thinking, and meaning. And those are the things that can help you get through. And let's talk about, how do you build resilience? Again, that word perception. Do you look at it as traumatic when something happens, or do you look at it as an opportunity to learn and grow? And then these are the people that I've decided to use as examples. When you're thinking about people who've survived trauma, that the Adam Walsh is the little boy who was killed, abducted in 1981. And this is his dad created the show America's Most Wanted. The Newtown shootings, people have created all sorts of foundations and programs and legislative efforts. The Boston Marathon, people ran in the marathon again after the bombing. The common ingredient is resilience. And building resilience is an ethical responsibility if we are going to care for others. And I believe that very strongly. So summing up, Turning compassion fatigue into resilience and compassion satisfaction involves reframing. So that's the resilience piece, taking personal responsibility, managing your reactions, and finding that meaning, and then that physical and emotional self-care, and collaborating and connecting, having that social connection. And then we're going to talk about organizational health very briefly. And here's where I'm going to say, walk in someone else's shoes. So I'm asking those of you who are managers, board members, directors, to look at the staff and volunteer experience and see what it is that they go through. They're exposed to suffering. They've got that workload, the drama, the trauma, the management issues, the moral conflict, which we talked about, and then the isolation where your friends and family don't get it. And as we've said, we change because of this work. So as someone who's in charge, this is what these people are going through. And then I'm asking staff and volunteer to turn around and look at the board and the management role. They have to make sure the mission is carried out. They have to oversee finances, the executive director and the manager. They have to set policies, and they have to deal with public expectations and PR, et cetera. And they have to understand the level of stress and all the issues that are going on. They have to figure out how to build a relationship with shelter staff and volunteers. And then they have to figure out how to fix things if things are broken. And that would involve hiring someone like a mediator. So walk a mile in other shoes. The bigger implications of compassion fatigue, what you might experience are all these on the left: the anger, the drama, the dark humor, the objectifying of animals, and much, much more. The effect on the organization is what really can make or break how the organization does. So the low morale, the complaining, the cynicism, the conflict between all sorts of people, and the reputation of the organization suffers. The turnover increases, and the animals, again, the bottom line is the animals, and they're getting shortchanged because we can't figure out how to behave or how to manage our relationships. So organizational healing strategies, this is for everybody. So it's communication and acknowledgement. It's the common purpose that they all bring, that they all have to agree upon and adhere to. It's an opportunity to learn and grow, and this whole balanced flexibility and consistency. When you're consistent, sometimes that can mean that's the way we've always done it, and that's not very open-minded. And so being consistent is not being so hard-lined that you can't see other ways of doing things. And it involves also being flexible enough to say, I'm open-minded. Respect and integrity just go without saying, being accountable, and then following through. If you're going to do something, do it. And these are all about trust and relationships. So some final thoughts. This is from Eric Gentry, the therapist that I told you about that I trained with. Animal care professionals are some of the most pain-saturated people I have ever worked with. The very thing that makes them great at their work, their empathy and dedication and love for animals, makes them vulnerable. Sad, but it's true. The good news is that feeling compassion fatigue is a sign that you are a deeply caring person. And when we care for ourselves, we can care for others from a place of abundance, not scarcity. With the development of healthy self-care routines, you can continue to successfully provide compassionate care to others. So that is from the Argus Institute. And I think that they do work on pet loss and support for pet loss. So it's about caring for ourselves so that we can operate from a place of abundance. I think that's very important. And so turning compassion fatigue around, caring for yourself, both physically and emotionally, Collaborate, connect, and find support. That's the social part of it. And then the more spiritual part of it, find meaning, take personal responsibility, manage your reactions. And that means managing your perceptions sometimes, and working on developing resiliency so that you reframe your view, and then working toward organizational health. And as a result of all of that, the animals benefit from us being emotionally healthy. So being good at your job should also include the pursuit of strength, wholeness, and a fundamental shift about the value of doing self-care. And you can learn about ways to find that center place when you can where you can protect yourself emotionally while you're helping animals. You can do both at the same time. It takes work, but you can do it. And I will close by saying that I just took a screenshot of the resources that I sent to you. There are a bunch of things in there. I'm looking at the articles about shelter workers, and I was reading Managing Emotions in an Animal Shelter by Arnie Arluk. Arnie Arluk has really done a lot of research into animal shelter people, and he is an emeritus professor at Northeastern University. Really worth reading. It's old, but it's still true. It's 1994, but it matters. And lots of stuff that I've put in this resources page or pages that I hope will help you. The one thing I always like to close with is that this might stir things up for some of you, and I understand that. And I hope that you will take care of yourselves and your hearts when you turn this off. And if you feel any need, I am not a licensed therapist, but if you feel any need to talk, I can help you by pointing you in the right direction. Don't suffer alone, okay? And with that, I'm going to show my contact information. And then I will start. Somebody.
Okay, and there's a lot of great questions in the chat or in the Q&A, so I'm gonna help you with those, okay?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So I'm gonna go back up to the top here. Okay, so and my dog's going crazy.
I know.
Does having PTSD predispose to compassion fatigue?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. They're separate. Yeah, PTSD can create a nice little garden bed for compassion fatigue. So if you have any sort of trauma history, you're kind of primed, potentially primed for compassion fatigue.
Okay, and then another question is, what's the difference between depression and compassion fatigue? I feel like a lot of symptoms of compassion fatigue are depression.
Very similar, very similar. And depression can involve chemical issues going on in your body and in your brain. And so can compassion fatigue. So sometimes getting to a therapist and getting yourself on a medication regimen. But I will say this, you can't just be on meds. You got to be on meds with some therapy. All the studies say that one or the other isn't as successful. And so very important to have a professional that can help you with that.
Great. And then this is, I think the next one is a really great question, which is, what can I do as a boss to help decrease compassion fatigue and burnout in my staff?
Thank you for asking, whoever you are. That's great. So
that was Rachel.
It's Rachel. Okay. As a boss, I think it's really important to talk personally with each of your staff members and find out what's going on with them. You don't need to get into all their nitty-gritty personal stuff, but you need to understand who they are. I think it's really important too to make it very clear what the mission is, and to make it very clear that if they can't sign on to the mission, then there are other jobs that might be better for them, or other organizations that might be better for them. And I think a lot of compassion fatigue comes from this, sort of clashing over missions and whether they're correct or not, and who's making what decisions, and also who's got what lanes, and is everybody staying in their lanes. But as a boss, I think more than anything, it's communication and forging a relationship with each person so that you understand where they're coming from, and drawing boundaries too, and not letting people behave badly and affect the greater effort of the organization.
Great. The next question is, oh, my dogs have broken into my room. How common is understanding of compassion fatigue among therapists or support staff? And do therapists understand that it's based on trauma to others and trauma to animals in particular?
Can you say the first part?
How common is an understanding of compassion fatigue among therapists? So I think she's asking, like, if we do go to therapy, how are they going to understand like what it is that we go through in our jobs?
Okay, so that brings up what I've been working on for a really long time, and one of these days it's going to come out. But what therapists are they mean well, but they say stuff. And I've had people who say things to me like, yeah, I went to a therapist and she said I should go for a walk at lunchtime every day. Well, that's great. That just doesn't really get to the bottom of it. And so you can't really blame a therapist who doesn't understand this field. This is a very different field, and unless you're in it, you can't possibly understand it. And so how do you translate what you're going through at work and in your life to someone who says, oh, I love puppies? That it's a really hard stretch, and it's very frustrating. So I've been working on a document for animal people to give to their therapist, actually, to explain what we go through. What is our life like? And I've been working on that because I think it's so hard to explain it. Or maybe this document is going to I have a friend who's working with me on this, and she suggested having the document have bullet points so that the person going for therapy can say, these are the things I need for you to understand. So I am working on that. And when I get it done, I will post it on the Max site and other places. Okay.
That's
But
amazing.
in the meantime, I would say you need to tell your therapist that this is something that you need for them to learn about, and give them some articles, give them some of the resources that I have provided on the resources list so that they get at least some of it.
Yeah, that's amazing. I personally had an experience where I took my daughter to a therapist for anxiety, and the therapist told me I had to get rid of my pets because they said I had too many pets that was contributing to chaos in the household. And I think like she just didn't understand that for us, our pets is like part of our therapy.
Yeah,
So anyways, next question is, in this work, many of us struggle with work-life balance because we're either on call all the time, or there's an implied expectation to always be available, like for after hours, text messages, etc. How can lower level staff draw a line and say no in order to reserve some self-care time outside of work when the communication never stops from above?
You have to educate above about your need for sanity. And that means standing up for yourself. And that means this is the whole self-knowledge thing, the self-awareness thing, the ability to draw boundaries. And if you can't do that stuff, then maybe find yourself a therapist to help you figure out how to create boundaries and stick with them, because your boss needs to understand that if you're limping along on 3 tires, you're not going to be able to do good work in the long run. And unfortunately, you'll probably end up burning out to the point where you quit. So that's something you have to educate your boss about how, the pressure that you're getting and the nonstop relentlessness is killing you. I don't know if that helps or not, but that's really, it's about boundaries.
Yeah, I think it's just good to set examples across the board. Okay, next question. What is your recommendation when communication lines have been broken, when people are angry, frustrated at each other? Seems like group meetings are not useful.
Oh yeah, I've heard that before. Honestly, when you get to that point, maybe a mediator, maybe um, all of you going back to your corners. And then, I mean, it's really hard to fix something when everybody's so invested and they can't see, from a third perspective. So it might be worth asking someone to come in and mediate. And there are mediation organizations that could actually help with this. And I could help you find actually a friend who's a mediator. And I don't know if she'd be able to do that, but that could be really interesting.
Oops, sorry, sticky fingers. This is a kind of a simple question. If we do find we need to take a break and we finally take one, how long should the break be for?
Oh boy, that's so hard to say. It depends on how bad off you are. And if you do take a break, will you be able to get back in where you were before? And does that matter? And there's so many variables. I'm happy to talk to somebody if they want to reach out to me and, see if we could sort of craft a little plan, if that would help. Or maybe what you do is ask for maybe not a break, but half a break, ask for 3 days a week or mornings only, or, different responsibilities that are less stressful. Again, you can reach out. I'll try to help you figure that out if you'd like.
And Andrea is putting in the chat that she will is happy if people want to reach out to her as well.
She's my friend who's
she says she's your friend. Yeah. So the last question, Anne, is actually about the kitten numbers in Massachusetts. So I saved that to the end. I didn't know if you wanted to address that or not. I was like, it's not directly related to compassion fatigue, but you did discuss it. It just says, do you think everyone understands why the number of kittens has dramatically dropped? Recognizing the problems need to be addressed before kittens go to, I mean, that question is actually kind of close to my heart, as I feel like we haven't done enough to talk about how important spay neuter has been and how we need to continue supporting spay neuter. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
I do. I have big thoughts on that. I totally agree with you. And we can't stop. And COVID has really put us behind the 8 ball again. And that's in terms of a lot of things, but spay neuter. And yeah, that's something that, kittens being born is something that is happening. Yes, I understand that we have colonies and you don't have colonies of dogs, but the fact that there's so few puppies being born in this state, compared to how many kittens are born, we're not done.
So right? True. Yep, we are not done. Right. Let me see. There's one more just popped up. Let me see what that one is. Oh, 2 more. Oh, yep, commenting that we have colonies. Yep, that's true. And then just people sharing resources. I think you might have got through all the questions. Oh, there's one more. Okay. I just found here. How do you deal with cruelty cases when courts don't match the punishment with the crime and the public thinks you haven't done your job when you've exhausted all your resources?
Oh boy, Christine, I see it's you. Yeah, that is a source of such stress and such frustration. And I know what you're saying. And I've been involved in cases that should have been treated differently. The courts don't get it yet, unfortunately. And we have a lot of work to do. I mean, as advanced a state as we are, in terms of animal welfare, we have a lot of work to do, because we have to educate the courts. And probably the real unfortunate thing is that animals are not the priority, and we need to figure out how to make them the priority. And that's the challenge. And Christine, I know.
All right, you got through all the Q&A. Lots of thank yous in the chat. And you're welcome. Thank you very much. That was a great talk. I think there was something in there for everyone. Everyone could find something useful in that.
That's great. I hope so. And anybody who wants to reach out, feel free. Okay.
All right, I think we're all set. Thank you very much. Thanks to Mac for putting this on. Julia, any last
thanks,
words
Mac.
before we close?
Just stay
No,
safe,
afterwards, just
everybody.
thank you to everybody for listening and being here tonight. And thank you, Anne.
You're
A lot of really
welcome.
great information. And Emily, it's always super helpful to have you moderating and having you guys host. We appreciate it a lot.
No problem. We love having our Mac friends on with us.
Thank you, Emily, very much. And
No
Ginny.
problem. No problem. You're getting tons of nice thank yous in the chat. I don't know if you can see those popping up.
I can't do two things at once.
I know.
But thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
We all set?
I think we're all set. I'm gonna
Yeah.
stop the recording.
Okay. Stay safe.